Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today we'll delve into the icy shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, in the heart of North Carolina, where the winter of 1898 brought with it not only snow and solitude, but a mystery that still haunts the records of that isolated region. Comment where you're watching from and get ready, because this story will reveal secrets that have remained buried for over a century. It was the late 19th century, and the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina were a world apart. While cities like Charlotte and Raleigh were beginning to experience the first stirrings of modernization, with electric streetcars and telegraph lines, the communities scattered across the mountain slopes lived much as their ancestors had lived 100 years earlier. The roads were precarious trails that wound between centuries-old pines and oaks. In winter, these same trails turned into treacherous traps of ice and frozen mud. Madison County, located in western North Carolina, was one of those places where time seemed to stand still. With a population of just over 15,000 scattered across deep valleys and mist-shrouded peaks, the county was known for its modest tobacco farms and mica mining on the higher slopes. The county seat, Marshall, was a village with barely 300 permanent residents, its single main street lined with weather-blackened wooden buildings, and a stone courthouse that served as the center of all local justice. Margaret Crowe arrived in Marshall in the fall of 1897. No one knew exactly where she came from, although some later records suggest she had left Virginia after becoming a widow. Margaret was approximately 35 years old, with dark hair always tied back in a severe bun, and eyes that neighbors described as intense and disturbing. She rented a small log cabin on the south slope of Mount Mitchell, about 5 miles from the village, on property owned by a local farmer named Josiah Hendricks. The cabin was rustic, even by the standards of the time. It consisted of 2 main rooms, with poorly sealed log walls that let in the cold wind during winter nights. There was a stone fireplace that took up almost one entire wall, a small cast-iron stove, and windows covered with oilcloth instead of glass. Margaret paid her monthly rent of $2.50 by working occasionally as a seamstress for the wealthier families in Marshall. She embroidered and mended clothes with recognized skill, but she rarely spoke about her former life. Margaret's first months in the area were marked by an isolation she seemed to cultivate herself. She would go down to Marshall once a week to buy basic supplies at Solomon Green's general store, always paying in precisely counted coins. Solomon, a 60-year-old man who knew every resident of the county, would comment to his wife that there was something strange in Margaret's eyes, something he couldn't quite define, but that made him uneasy. Other residents shared this diffuse sense of unease, though no one could point to anything concrete to justify such an impression. The winter of 1897 to 1898 was particularly severe in the Appalachian Mountains. Snow began falling in early December and continued until March, accumulating in layers that, in some valleys, reached chest deep. Trails were impassable for weeks at a time. Families living on the higher slopes were completely isolated, relying solely on their reserves of dried food and smoked meat to survive until spring. It was during that cruel winter that Margaret Crowe began receiving visitors. The first person to notice was Emma Hendricks, Josiah's wife, who lived on the main farm about a mile from Margaret's cabin. Emma had climbed the hillside one January afternoon to bring a jar of apple preserves as a gesture of neighborliness, and that was when she saw a man leaving Margaret's property. He wore a heavy overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. Emma greeted him, but he only waved briefly and continued down the trail without a word. Over the next few weeks, Emma noticed other visitors. Always men, always alone, always during twilight or early evening. She mentioned this to Josiah, who nonchalantly replied that Margaret was probably receiving sewing clients, but Emma wasn't convinced. There was something furtive about the way these men arrived and departed, always avoiding being seen, always choosing the darkest hours. In February of 1898, a traveler named Thomas Whitfield passed through Marshall. Thomas was a traveling patent medicine salesman who roamed the mountainous counties of North Carolina and Tennessee, selling tonics, elixirs, and ointments of dubious efficacy. He was known for his loose tongue and for frequenting local taverns, where he traded gossip and stories in exchange for food and drink. It was Thomas who, after a few shots of corn whiskey at Henry Bolton's tavern, began spreading disturbing rumors about Margaret Crowe. According to Thomas, he had been to Margaret's cabin 3 nights earlier. He described the interior as dark and stifling, with tallow candles burning in makeshift candelabras and a sickly, sweet smell he couldn't identify. Margaret, he said, offered more than just sewing. She performed fortune-telling, prepared herbal remedies for various ailments, and according to even quieter whispers, offered other services that Thomas didn't explicitly specify, but made clear through suggestive glances and knowing laughter. Rumors spread through Marshall like wildfire. In a small, deeply religious community, where 3 Baptist churches competed for the souls of the faithful, suspicions about Margaret quickly turned to damning certainties. She was an outsider, a woman without a family, living alone in the mountains and entertaining men at night. For the more conservative residents, this was proof enough of immoral behavior. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison was the first to raise his voice against Margaret Crowe. Ezekiel was the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church, Marshall's largest congregation, with nearly 150 regular members. He was 42 years old, with a graying beard that reached down to his chest, and a reputation as a fiery preacher who was unafraid to confront what he called sin and corruption. The Sunday after Thomas Whitfield's rumors spread, Ezekiel took the pulpit and delivered a sermon that many in attendance would never forget. He didn't mention Margaret by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Ezekiel thundered about women living without the protection of husbands or fathers, about outsiders, bringing corrupt customs into pure communities, about the need to expel impurity before it contaminated the entire congregation. His voice echoed off the wooden walls of the church as he quoted biblical passages about temptation and perdition. When he finished, there was a heavy silence in the air, broken only by the muffled sobs of a few more sensitive women. But not everyone in Marshall shared Reverend Morrison's indignation. There were those who defended Margaret, or at least defended her right to live in peace. Among them was Sarah Pritchard, a 53-year-old widow who ran a small boarding house on Main Street. Sarah had met Margaret a few months earlier when she brought a dress for fitting, and the two had spoken at length about the difficulty of single women surviving in a world ruled by men. Sarah saw in Margaret not a sinner, but a woman trying to survive as best she could in difficult circumstances. Sarah was not alone in her defense. The county physician, Dr. Benjamin Clark, a 61-year-old graduate of a Philadelphia medical school, also cautioned against rushing to judgment. Dr. Clark had once treated Margaret when she suffered a deep cut on her hand while working with fabric, and he had found her to be a polite and sensible woman. He publicly warned that rumors and gossip did not constitute evidence, and that the community should be careful before destroying someone's reputation based solely on innuendo. But the voices of moderation were quickly drowned out by the rising tide of hostility. By March 1898, when the snow finally began to melt and the trails became passable again, Margaret's situation had deteriorated dramatically. Solomon Green, pressured by prominent church members, informed her that he could no longer sell her groceries from his store. Josiah Hendricks, whose lease on the cabin was due to expire at the end of April, made it clear that he would not renew the lease. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. With no access to food and nowhere to live within a few weeks, she needed to act quickly. She tried to talk to Sarah Pritchard about renting a room at the boarding house, but Sarah, though sympathetic, explained that she couldn't risk her own reputation and business by sheltering someone the community had branded as undesirable. It was a painful conversation for both of them, filled with tears and sad hugs, but the economic reality was inescapable. It was then that Margaret made a decision that would change everything. In the 3rd week of March, she went down to Marshall and sought out the county sheriff, a man named William Dockery. William was 39 years old, had served briefly in the army during the Civil War as a teenager, and upheld the law in Madison with a mixture of pragmatism and firmness. Margaret entered his office, a small room on the ground floor of the stone courthouse, and filed a formal complaint. She claimed she was being unfairly persecuted, that the rumors about her were false and malicious, and that her safety was at risk. Margaret showed William anonymous letters she had received, crudely written messages that called her a witch and a whore, threatened to burn down her cabin with her inside, and promised she would never find peace in Madison. The letters were disturbing, not only for their content, but for the visceral rage that emanated from each scribbled word. William Dockery listened to Margaret in silence, examining the letters with a grave expression. He was a lawman, but he was also part of this community, and he knew well the tensions that could arise when an outsider challenged established norms. He promised Margaret he would investigate the threats, but his body language betrayed skepticism. When she left his office, William sat for a long time, looking at the letters spread out on his desk, pondering what he should do. That same evening, William visited Reverend Morrison. The two men sat in the pastor's study lit by oil lamps and discussed the case of Margaret Crowe. The Reverend was adamant that the woman was reaping what she had sown, that her own immoral actions had generated the righteous indignation of the community. William, more cautious, expressed concern about the possibility of violence. He had seen before how mobs could form quickly in small communities, how collective anger could turn ordinary people into something dangerous. Reverend Morrison assured William that there would be no violence. The church, he said, would handle the situation through appropriate and Christian means. They would continue to isolate Margaret socially and economically until she had no choice but to leave. There would be no need for physical confrontation, only the firm application of moral and commercial pressure. William left that conversation only partially reassured, but without any legal basis for doing otherwise. The following days brought a deceptive calm. Margaret remained in her cabin, rarely seen. Emma Hendricks, still curious despite her husband's warnings not to get involved, climbed the hillside once to check on her neighbor. She found Margaret sitting outside the cabin, gazing at the distant mountains shrouded in a characteristic Appalachian blue haze. The two women spoke briefly. Margaret thanked Emma for her kindness over the months and said something Emma would never forget, that mountains hold secrets, and some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. Emma didn't fully understand what Margaret meant, but she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something final in those words, something that suggested farewell or resolution. Emma walked down the trail back to her farm with a heavy heart, a vague sense that something terrible was about to happen, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. On the morning of March 28, 1898, Josiah Hendricks went up to Margaret's cabin to discuss the final details of the lease termination. He knocked on the door several times, but received no answer. Concerned, though he tried not to show it, Josiah pushed the door open, which gave easily and was unlocked. What he found inside would forever change that community and begin one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. Josiah Hendricks stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. His brain struggled to process the scene before him, to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. The cabin was in complete disarray. Furniture toppled over, broken dishes strewn across the wooden floor, torn fabrics hung from the shelves like silent ghosts. But it was the fireplace that held his attention, the stone structure that took up nearly the entire north wall of the main room. Something was burning there. Even though it was late morning, embers still glowed faintly among the ashes, and a pungent, disturbing smell filled the air. Josiah covered his nose and mouth with his sleeve and approached slowly, his steps making the floorboards creak under his weight. When he peered into the fireplace, his stomach churned. Among the ashes and the remains of burned firewood were fragments of something he couldn't immediately identify, but it didn't look natural, didn't look like ordinary wood or fabric. Josiah backed away quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He searched for Margaret, calling her name in a shaky voice, but the cabin was empty. The second room, which served as their bedroom, showed signs of a hasty departure. The bed was unmade, the small trunk where Margaret kept her clothes was open and empty, and the cracked mirror hanging on the wall reflected only the chaos left behind. Margaret Crowe was gone. Josiah descended the mountain faster than he had ever descended before, nearly running down the slippery trail, tripping over roots and loose rocks. He went straight to Sheriff William Dockery's office and reported, between labored breaths, what he had found. William listened with increasing attention, asking specific questions about the condition of the cabin, the remains in the fireplace, any signs of violence or struggle. Then he grabbed his hat and revolver, called his deputy, a 23-year-old named Marcus Flynn, and the three men climbed together to the Hendricks property. The initial investigation was conducted with the caution appropriate for a disturbing scene. William Dockery had limited experience with serious criminal cases. Most of his work involved resolving fence disputes, arresting drunks, and occasionally tracking down cattle rustlers. But he knew he needed to document everything carefully. He asked Marcus to take detailed notes as they examined each room in the cabin. The remains in the fireplace were carefully removed and placed in a canvas bag. William recognized bone fragments, too small to be human, probably from animals, but there were also partially burned pieces of cloth, charred pages of what appeared to be books or notebooks, and something that deeply disturbed him, what appeared to be strands of human hair, still held together by what might have been scalp, but so damaged by the fire that it was impossible to be certain. Josiah Hendricks watched from outside the cabin, refusing to re-enter. He was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he tried to light his pipe, and he kept repeating that he should never have rented that place to her, that he had known from the beginning that something was wrong with that woman. William tried to calm him, explaining that they still didn't know exactly what had happened, but his own words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The search for Margaret Crowe began immediately. William organized groups of men to scour the trails leading out of that area of the mountains. There were 3 main routes, one that descended toward Marshall, another that headed north toward the Tennessee border, and a third that led east, winding through deep valleys until eventually reaching the city of Asheville, about 35 miles away. Each group received clear instructions. Look for a woman approximately 35 years old, dark-haired, likely carrying a trunk or suitcase, possibly on foot or in a borrowed wagon. For 3 days, the groups scoured the mountains. They questioned every isolated farmer, every family living in the remote valleys, every traveler they crossed paths with. No one had seen Margaret Crowe. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the bluish mist that perpetually shrouded those ancient peaks. Frustration grew among the searchers, especially when rain began to fall on the 3rd day, a cold spring rain that turned the trails into rivers of mud and erased any trace Margaret might have left. Meanwhile, in Marshall, rumors were multiplying like weeds after rain. The story of the ramshackle cabin and the disturbing remains in the fireplace spread quickly, but as with all stories retold many times, it grew and became distorted with each repetition. Some claimed William had found complete human bones in the fireplace. Others whispered that satanic symbols were painted on the walls. Some swore they'd heard from someone who knew someone that Margaret performed dark rituals at midnight, sacrificing animals and summoning evil spirits. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison seized the moment. The Sunday after the discovery, he preached a sermon even more fiery than the previous one. He declared that the community had been infiltrated by something evil, that only constant vigilance and unwavering faith could protect them from dark forces. He urged the faithful to remain alert, to report any suspicious behavior, to keep their families close and to keep their doors locked. The church was packed that Sunday with people standing in the back and crowded outside, all eager to hear the Reverend's words, all seeking some explanation for the fear that had settled in their hearts. But not everyone was convinced of the narrative being constructed. Sarah Pritchard, the boarding house owner, publicly expressed her doubts. She pointed out that no one really knew what had happened in that cabin, that the remains in the fireplace could have perfectly innocent explanations, that Margaret could have simply left after being harassed beyond endurance by the community. Sarah suggested that perhaps they should examine their own consciences before pointing accusatory fingers at a woman who was no longer there to defend herself. Sarah's words met with little support. In fact, her defense of Margaret only served to cast suspicion on herself. Rumors began to circulate that Sarah had been complicit with Margaret, that she knew more than she was willing to reveal, that perhaps her boarding house served as a meeting place for illicit activities. Sarah felt the weight of ostracism beginning to shift toward her, and wisely decided to silence her opinions, at least in public. Dr. Benjamin Clark faced similar pressure. After expressing caution against rash judgments, he began to notice that some of his regular patients stopped seeing him, preferring to travel extra miles to see other doctors in neighboring counties. The message was clear. Questioning the official narrative had social and economic consequences. On the 10th day after Margaret's disappearance, William Dockery received a letter. It had been left in his office overnight, slipped under the door, with no return address. The letter was written in elegant, firm handwriting, completely different from the crude threats Margaret had shown him weeks earlier. William read the letter 3 times, each reading increasing his bewilderment and discomfort. The letter was short, but every word seemed to have been chosen with deliberate care. It said simply, "Sheriff Dockery, the secrets you seek are not in the mountains but in the hearts of those who remain. Margaret Crowe knew too much, and her silence cost her dearly. Search the county records for the names she never mentioned. The truth lies buried where no one dares dig." There was no signature, no date, just those enigmatic lines written in black ink on fine paper. William sat in his wooden chair for a long time, the letter resting on his desk, as the afternoon light streamed in through the dusty windows of his office. He was a practical man, trained to deal with hard facts and tangible evidence, not cryptic messages and vague innuendos, but something about that letter bothered him deeply, a visceral sense that there were layers to the case he hadn't even begun to unravel. He decided to follow the letter's suggestion, strange as it was. The next day, William went down to the courthouse basement, where the county's old records were kept. It was a dank, dimly lit space, with wooden shelves sagging under the weight of decades of documents, property records, birth and death certificates, court cases, tax returns, all meticulously filed by generations of diligent clerks. William began with the property records, searching for Margaret Crowe's name. He found the lease with Josiah Hendricks, dated October 1897, but nothing else. Then he expanded his search, looking for any document that mentioned her name. That's when he found something unexpected. A Virginia marriage certificate, filed in Madison for unclear reasons, dated 1883. Margaret Crowe, then named Margaret Ashford, had married a man named Daniel Crowe in Richmond, Virginia. The document listed Daniel's occupation as a tobacco merchant. William carefully copied every detail into his notebook. But it was what he found next that truly disturbed him. A death certificate for Daniel Crowe, registered in Richmond in 1892, just 9 years after the marriage. The cause of death listed on the document was accidental arsenic poisoning. William was familiar with arsenic. It was commonly used to control pests in grain and tobacco warehouses, and fatal accidents were not uncommon. But there was a handwritten note in the margin of the certificate, nearly illegible after years of dampness in the basement. Investigation conducted by the Richmond Police Department. Case closed due to lack of evidence. William felt a chill run down his spine. This meant there had been enough suspicion surrounding Daniel Crowe's death to warrant a police investigation, even though nothing had apparently been proven. He continued his search through the archives, now with renewed determination. It took him another 3 hours, sifting through dusty stacks of old documents, but he finally found something else: official correspondence between the Richmond Police Department and the Madison County Sheriff, dated 1897. The letter, written by Richmond Sheriff James Patterson, informed the then Sheriff of Madison, William's predecessor, that a woman named Margaret Crowe might have moved to that jurisdiction. The letter requested that the sheriff keep a discreet eye on her, as although there was insufficient evidence to prosecute, Richmond police remained suspicious of her involvement in her husband's death. The letter concluded with a request to be notified if any suspicious incidents involving Margaret Crowe occurred. William checked the records. There was no response on file, no indication that the previous sheriff had even acknowledged receipt of the letter. It was possible it had gotten lost in the bureaucracy, or that the previous sheriff, an elderly man nearing retirement, had simply ignored it. But the bottom line was that Margaret Crowe had lived in Madison for months without anyone in authority knowing about her potentially troubled past. William emerged from the basement carrying copies of all the relevant documents. He sat back down in his office and organized everything on his desk, trying to construct a coherent timeline. Margaret had married in 1883. Her husband had died under suspicious circumstances 9 years later, and she had apparently lived in Richmond for another 5 years before finally moving to Madison in the fall of 1897. What had she done during those 5 intervening years? Why had she chosen the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina as her destination? He needed more information. William wrote a detailed letter to the Richmond Police Department, requesting all available records regarding the investigation into Daniel Crowe's death and any additional information about Margaret. He knew the response would take weeks to arrive. Communication between counties and states was slow back then, relying on couriers traveling by train and wagon, but it was a necessary step. Meanwhile, life in Marshall struggled to return to some semblance of normalcy, though tensions lingered just beneath the surface. People spoke in hushed tones on the streets, cast suspicious glances at one another, and locked their doors more carefully at dusk. There was a pervasive sense that something fundamental had changed in the community, that an innocence had been lost and could not be regained. Emma Hendricks began having nightmares. She dreamed of Margaret Crowe walking through the mountains under the moonlight, her figure gradually dissolving until she became part of the mist itself. Emma would wake in the middle of the night, covered in a cold sweat, her heart racing, unable to fall back asleep. She didn't tell anyone about the dreams, not even Josiah, but they began to affect her health. She lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes, and began avoiding looking in the direction of the abandoned cabin on the hillside. The cabin itself became an object of morbid fascination. Marshallese children and teenagers began daring each other to climb up there after dark, proving their courage by touching the log walls before running back down the trail, giggling nervously and claiming to have heard strange voices or seen shadows moving in the empty windows. Parents forbade such expeditions, but this only increased the cabin's appeal as a destination for forbidden adventures. Reverend Morrison publicly proposed that the cabin be burned, that the site be purified by fire, and that nothing should remain as a reminder of that dark time. But Josiah Hendricks, who still owned the property, refused, not out of any sentimental attachment to the site, but because burning a dry wooden structure in the mountains during the spring, when the vegetation was beginning to dry out after the wet winter, could easily trigger a disastrous wildfire. The cabin would remain standing, at least for now, a silent monument to the disturbing events of that spring. In mid-April, William Dockery finally received a response from Richmond. The package contained several documents, including the full report of the investigation into Daniel Crowe's death. William read it all with increasing attention, taking notes as he absorbed the details of the case. The Richmond police report was extensive and meticulously detailed, running to 17 pages of small print. Daniel Crowe had died at his home on the night of August 14, 1892, after 3 days of severe illness, characterized by intense vomiting, acute abdominal pain, and convulsions. The attending physician initially diagnosed him with cholera, a common disease at the time, especially during the hot summer months when contaminated water caused periodic outbreaks in the cities. Margaret had called the doctor only on the second day of Daniel's illness, explaining that she had initially thought it was just a passing illness. When the doctor arrived, he found Daniel in critical condition, delirious with a high fever and extremely dehydrated. The doctor did what he could, administering laudanum for the pain and trying to keep the patient hydrated, but Daniel died the next morning, surrounded only by Margaret and the housekeeper, an elderly woman named Ruth Henderson. The body was prepared for burial quickly, as was customary with deaths from contagious diseases. Daniel was buried in the cemetery of St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond 2 days after his death. The story could have ended there, another tragic but not uncommon death in an era when infectious diseases claimed lives regularly. But 3 weeks after the burial, a man named Robert Thornton contacted the Richmond police with disturbing information. Robert was a business partner of Daniel Crowe, and the two had worked together in the tobacco trade for 6 years. He explained to investigators that Daniel had changed his will just 2 months before his death, an act Robert found extremely suspicious. The previous will, made shortly after his marriage to Margaret, left most of the estate to members of Daniel's family, with a reasonable portion reserved for Margaret as widow. The new will, signed in June 1892, left everything to Margaret without exception. Even more disturbing, Robert revealed that Daniel had confided in him, just days before signing the new will, that Margaret had threatened to leave him if he didn't include her more generously in his estate plans. Daniel was torn, according to Robert, because he loved Margaret but also felt manipulated by her. He had mentioned that Margaret had secrets from her past that she had never fully shared, and that he sometimes felt uncomfortable with certain aspects of her behavior that he couldn't clearly pinpoint. Based on this information, the Richmond Police Department obtained an exhumation order. Daniel Crowe's body was unearthed in September 1892, 6 weeks after his burial. A medical examiner examined the remains and collected tissue and organ samples, which were sent for chemical analysis to a laboratory in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the few places in the region with adequate equipment to detect poisons. The results came back 3 months later and confirmed the suspicions. Elevated levels of arsenic were found in Daniel Crowe's liver, kidneys, and hair, in amounts far exceeding what would be considered normal environmental exposure. The amount detected was consistent with deliberate poisoning over several days, possibly weeks, culminating in the fatal doses that caused his death. Margaret was questioned by Richmond police in December 1892. The interrogation report described her as calm and collected, answering questions with a firm voice and direct gaze. She categorically denied any involvement in her husband's death. Regarding the arsenic, she explained that she kept a supply at home for rat control, a common practice. She suggested that Daniel could have been accidentally exposed to the poison through contaminated food or from his own hands after handling the arsenic packets in the warehouse where he worked. Regarding the will, Margaret explained that she had spoken to Daniel about the unfairness of leaving his wife only a small portion of the inheritance, especially considering that she had helped manage the business for years. She denied making any threats, characterizing her conversation with Daniel as normal discussions between husband and wife about family financial planning. The police searched for additional evidence. They interviewed Ruth Henderson, the housekeeper, who confirmed that Margaret had cared for Daniel during his illness, preparing his meals and administering his medications. Ruth hadn't noticed anything suspicious in Margaret's behavior, although she admitted that her employer kept certain kitchen cabinets locked and that only she had the keys. When asked what was in these cabinets, Ruth couldn't answer with certainty, only that Margaret kept her personal belongings there, including medicinal herbs that she used to make teas and tonics. Police attempted to obtain a warrant to search Margaret's home and examine the contents of these cabinets, but the judge denied the request, arguing that circumstantial evidence and vague testimony did not constitute sufficient probable cause. Margaret's keeping locked cabinets in her own home was not a crime, and the presence of arsenic could indeed be explained by accidental exposure, although that explanation was questionable given the amount found. The case remained open for months, but with no concrete physical evidence directly linking Margaret to the poisoning, and no witnesses who had seen her administer arsenic to Daniel, the district attorney decided there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. In May 1893, the investigation was officially closed with the notation, "Insufficient evidence to prosecute." Margaret remained in Richmond for another 4 years after the case was closed. During this time, according to records William had in hand, she lived off Daniel's inheritance, a considerable sum that included the house, the tobacco warehouse, and several investment properties. She sold the warehouse in 1894 and gradually liquidated other properties. In 1897, she sold the house and apparently left Richmond without informing anyone of her fate. William leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of this information. He now understood why the Richmond police had written to Madison County. Margaret wasn't just an outsider with a mysterious past. She was a woman who had been investigated for murder, who had escaped justice on legal technicalities, and who had deliberately chosen a remote spot in the mountains to rebuild her life, away from prying eyes and lingering suspicion. But this raised even more disturbing questions. If Margaret was capable of poisoning her husband to inherit his fortune, what else was she capable of? The remains found in the fireplace of her cottage took on new significance in light of these revelations. The nighttime visitors Emma Hendricks had observed, the rumors spread by Thomas Whitfield, it was all beginning to form a pattern William could not ignore. He decided he needed to act on this new information. William called a court meeting with the county prosecutor, a lawyer named Henry Ashford, no relation to Margaret despite the coincidence of her maiden name. Henry was 47 years old, had studied law through an apprenticeship with an older judge, and maintained a small office in Marshall, where he served private clients in addition to his duties as a prosecutor. William presented all the documents to Henry, explaining step by step what he had discovered. Henry listened quietly, occasionally asking questions to clarify details. When William finished, Henry remained silent for a long time, his fingers drumming on the table as he processed the legal implications of it all. Finally, Henry spoke. He explained that even with this new information about Margaret's past, they still had no concrete evidence that she had committed any crime in Madison. The remains in the fireplace were disturbing, but preliminary analysis suggested mostly bones from small animals, possibly rabbits or squirrels, which she might have used for food or other non-criminal purposes. The hair found was insufficient for definitive analysis, with the methods available at the time. Henry Ashford continued his legal analysis with the candor characteristic of someone well aware of the limitations of the judicial system of the time. He explained to William that without a body, without witnesses to a specific crime, and without conclusive forensic evidence, there was no basis for charging Margaret Crowe with any crime in Madison County. The fact that she had been suspected of poisoning in Virginia, while disturbing, was legally irrelevant to any proceedings in North Carolina, especially considering that she had never been formally charged or convicted. William argued that they certainly should do something. A woman with such a suspicious past had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a scene that suggested questionable activity, to say the least. Henry agreed that the situation was troubling, but insisted that moral concern did not equate to legal jurisdiction. He suggested they continue investigating, searching for Margaret in neighboring towns, and keeping watch in case she reappears. But as for issuing warrants or taking formal legal action, their hands were tied. The conversation between the two men was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Marcus Flynn, William's young deputy. Marcus was out of breath, clearly having rushed to the courtroom, and his first words caused both William and Henry to rise from their chairs simultaneously. A body had been found. The three men hurried down Marshall's main street to Solomon Green's establishment, where a small crowd had already gathered. Solomon stood outside, his normally rosy skin now pale as wax, pointing with a trembling hand toward the back of his store. William pushed through the onlookers, ordering them to stay where they were, and made his way to the back of the property where Solomon's small warehouse stood. The body lay on the warehouse's dirt floor, partially covered by burlap sacks. It wasn't Margaret Crowe. It was a man, and judging by the state of decomposition, he'd been dead for at least several weeks, possibly since late winter. William knelt carefully beside the body, shielding his nose from the putrid odor, and began his examination. The man was between 40 and 50 years old, with dark hair streaked with grey, a thick beard, and clothing that suggested a traveller or itinerant worker. There were no obvious signs of violence on the body, no visible injuries that could explain his death. William searched the man's pockets for identification and found a few belongings: a cheap pocket watch that had stopped at 3 hours and 15 minutes, some coins totaling $1.65, and a folded piece of paper with a name and address written in cursive, Margaret Crowe, Hendricks Estate, Mount Mitchell. The paper changed everything. William showed it to Henry Ashford, who had followed Marcus to the warehouse. The three men exchanged meaningful glances. They now had a direct connection between Margaret and a death, though they still didn't know the man's identity or the circumstances of his passing. Solomon Green was called in to explain what the body had looked like on his property. Solomon was visibly shaken, but he managed to recount the facts with reasonable coherence. He explained that he rarely used that particular storage room. It was an old building at the back of his property, where he kept broken tools and items he planned to repair eventually. He'd only gone there that morning because he was looking for a shovel he remembered putting away months ago. When he opened the door, the smell hit him immediately, and that was when he discovered the body. William asked when Solomon had last entered the warehouse before that day. Solomon thought carefully before answering that it had probably been in November of the previous year, before the heavy snowfalls began. This meant the body could have been there for months, possibly since December or January, hidden by the accumulated snow, and the fact that no one had reason to visit the isolated structure during the harsh winter. The investigation took on new urgency. William organized a systematic search throughout Marshall and the surrounding area, looking for any other bodies that might be hidden. He also sent telegrams to neighboring counties describing the man found and asking if anyone had reported missing persons matching the description. Marcus Flynn was tasked with questioning all Marshall residents about whether they had seen any strangers in town during the fall or winter, particularly anyone matching the dead man's appearance. Responses began to trickle in. Several people recalled seeing a man matching the description during the fall, though no one knew his name or where he was from. Sarah Pritchard, the boarding house owner, revealed crucial information. A man with that appearance had stayed at her boarding house for 2 nights in early November 1897. He had registered under the name John Patterson, claiming to be a spice merchant traveling through the region. Sarah remembered him because he had asked about women living alone in the area, explaining that he was looking for a distant relative he believed had moved there after being widowed. Sarah, ever helpful, had mentioned Margaret Crowe, the only single woman she knew living alone near Marshall. The man had thanked her for the information and left the next morning, saying he planned to visit her. Sarah's revelation created a disturbing scenario. A man had arrived in Marshall specifically looking for Margaret Crowe, or at least single women in the area. He had obtained information about Margaret's location and apparently visited her. After that, he simply disappeared, his body ending up hidden in Solomon Green's storage unit. The obvious question was, had Margaret killed this man? And if so, how and why? Dr. Benjamin Clark was called in to examine the body more thoroughly. He worked in the warehouse all afternoon, with William and Marcus watching and taking notes. Dr. Clark was careful and methodical, examining every part of the body that decomposition still allowed for evaluation. His preliminary conclusion was that the man had died of poisoning, although he couldn't determine the specific substance without more sophisticated chemical analysis. He based his conclusion on several factors: the absence of traumatic injuries, the position of the body, which suggested the man had died quickly and with little struggle, and certain tissue discolorations consistent with poisoning. Dr. Clark specifically mentioned that the symptoms were similar to those he had read in medical literature about arsenic poisoning, though he could not say with absolute certainty without laboratory tests. The mention of arsenic brought a knowing look to William and Henry. They now had a pattern. Margaret had been suspected of poisoning her husband with arsenic in Virginia, and now a man who had apparently sought her out was dead, possibly poisoned, under circumstances that linked her directly to him through the paper found in his pocket. William decided it was time to drastically expand the investigation. He wrote to authorities in Richmond, requesting any additional information about people who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances during the years Margaret lived there after Daniel Crowe's death. He also sent inquiries to counties throughout North Carolina and neighboring states, inquiring about recent disappearances of traveling men. While waiting for answers, William turned his attention to Margaret's mountain cabin. He organized a more thorough search than the first, this time specifically looking for evidence of poisoning or other foul play. A six-man team, including William, Marcus, and Dr. Clark, spent 2 full days examining every inch of the property. They found several disturbing things. In the second room, hidden under a loose floorboard, was a small metal chest containing glass vials filled with various liquids and powders. Dr. Clark examined each vial carefully. He identified some as common medicinal herbs: valerian for sleep, chamomile for digestion, peppermint oil for headaches. But there were 3 vials whose contents he couldn't visually identify. These vials were carefully packaged and sent for analysis to a laboratory in Asheville. The results from the Asheville lab arrived 2 weeks later, carried by a messenger who had ridden for a full day through the mountain trails. William opened the sealed envelope in his office, with Henry Ashford and Dr. Clark present as witnesses. The report confirmed his darkest suspicions. 2 of the 3 unidentified vials contained arsenic in the form of a white powder, dissolved in distilled water to create a solution that could be easily mixed into food or drink without being detected by taste. The 3rd vial contained strychnine, another potent poison often used to kill rodents, but equally lethal to humans in appropriate doses. The discovery completely transformed the nature of the investigation. Margaret Crowe not only possessed potentially lethal poisons, she kept them hidden under the floorboards of her cabin, in concentrations and preparations that suggested deliberate and planned use, not simply for household pest control. Henry Ashford stated that this, combined with John Patterson's body found in Solomon Green's warehouse and the paper linking him to Margaret, constituted sufficient probable cause to issue a formal arrest warrant for her. The warrant was issued on May 23, 1898, charging Margaret Crowe with first-degree murder in the death of John Patterson. Copies of the warrant were sent to every sheriff in North Carolina and adjacent states, along with a detailed description of Margaret and instructions that she be considered extremely dangerous. A $200 reward was offered for information leading to her capture, a significant sum that attracted the attention of bounty hunters and adventurers throughout the region, but Margaret remained invisible. Weeks turned into months without any confirmed sightings of her. There were occasional reports of a woman matching her description, seen as far away as Knoxville, Tennessee, Charleston, South Carolina, and even Louisville, Kentucky, but none of these sightings could be verified. It was as if she had simply vanished from the face of the earth, or as some superstitious Marshallese residents began to whisper, as if she had never been fully human in the first place. Meanwhile, responses to William's inquiries into other possible crimes began to reveal an even more disturbing pattern. The Richmond Police Department responded with information about 3 men who had disappeared during the years Margaret lived there after Daniel Crowe's death. All 3 were widowers or middle-aged single men, all had some modest wealth, and all had last been seen in the neighborhood of Margaret's home. The first was a hardware merchant named Albert Morrison, who disappeared in June 1893. He had been seen entering Margaret's house for what he described to a neighbor as a business discussion. He was never seen again. His family reported him missing, but police assumed he had simply left town, something not uncommon in that era of high mobility and few legal obligations to notify authorities of changes of residence. The second was a war veteran named Charles Pemberton, who disappeared in November 1894. Charles was known to have courted Margaret for several months, and several witnesses had seen them together at social occasions. Then suddenly, Charles simply disappeared. His war pension continued to be sent to his last known address, but it was never claimed. Again, the police saw no reason to suspect foul play, assuming Charles had moved elsewhere. The third was a lawyer named Theodore Blackwell, who disappeared in March 1896. Theodore had been seen visiting Margaret several times, and rumors circulated that he was helping her sell her properties. He disappeared 2 days before a scheduled meeting with important clients, something completely out of character for a professional who was normally meticulous about appointments. None of the 3 bodies had ever been found. At the time, each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, with no apparent connection beyond the fact that they all involved middle-aged men in Richmond. But now, with the passage of time and the revelation about Margaret, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 men had disappeared after known contact with her, all during the period when she was living off Daniel Crowe's inheritance, but before she sold all her properties and left Richmond. William shared this information with Henry Ashford and Reverend Morrison, who had become an influential voice in the community throughout the investigation. The reaction was mixed. Henry maintained his cautious legal perspective, pointing out that disappearances did not prove murder, and that linking Margaret to such cases without physical evidence would be legally problematic. But Reverend Morrison saw confirmation of his darkest suspicions, declaring in his sermon the following Sunday that evil forces had indeed walked among them, and that only by divine grace had the community been spared an even worse fate. Reverend Morrison's sermon had a profound effect on Marshall. The fear that had begun to subside as months passed without further incident returned with renewed force. People began locking their doors even during the day. Women refused to walk alone after dark, and any outsider arriving in town was met with suspicion and hostility. Marshall was becoming a closed and fearful community, a far cry from the relatively open and welcoming village it had been before Margaret Crowe's arrival. Sarah Pritchard, whose boarding house depended on travelers and visitors, saw her business decline dramatically. Many avoided Marshall altogether, having heard the dark rumors about the town. Those who needed to pass through did so quickly, not staying overnight if they could help it. Sarah tried to protest the climate of paranoia, but her words fell on deaf ears. The community needed a scapegoat for its fear, and Margaret Crowe, though absent, perfectly served that purpose. In July of 1898, 4 months after Margaret's disappearance, an unexpected development occurred. A bounty hunter named Elias Drummond arrived in Marshall, claiming to have information on Margaret's whereabouts. Elias was a tough man in his 50s, with scars on his face that told stories of violent confrontations and a reputation for always capturing his targets, no matter how long it took or how far he had to travel. Elias met privately with William Dockery and revealed that he had tracked Margaret to a small town on the North Carolina-Georgia border, a place called Murphy, located in the far western part of the state. According to Elias, Margaret was living under an assumed name, working as a seamstress for local families, trying to rebuild her life once again in a place where no one knew her past. William immediately organized an expedition to Murphy. He took with him Marcus Flynn, Elias Drummond, and 2 other trusted men of Marshall's. The journey took 3 days, traversing some of the most treacherous trails in the Appalachian Mountains. They traveled in silence for the most part, each man lost in his own thoughts about what might happen when they finally confronted Margaret Crowe. Murphy was an even smaller village than Marshall, with a population of perhaps 200, nestled in a narrow valley surrounded by densely forested mountains. They arrived at dusk on a warm July day, the golden light of the setting sun painting the clouds over the distant peaks. Elias led them to a small wooden house on the outskirts of town, a modest structure with a well-tended garden and white curtains in the windows. William knocked on the door, his hand resting on the holster of his revolver, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. There was a moment of silence, then footsteps approached. The door opened, and there she was. Margaret Crowe looked directly at William, and for a brief moment something passed over her face, perhaps resignation, perhaps relief. She didn't try to run away, didn't protest, or pretend not to know why they were there. She simply said, her voice calm and clear, "I've been waiting for you." Margaret Crowe was taken into custody without resistance. She asked for only a few minutes to gather some personal belongings, a request William granted after carefully searching the items to ensure they were free of weapons and poisons. She packed some clothes, a worn prayer book, and a framed photograph of a couple William assumed to be her and her late husband Daniel in happier times. As she packed her things, neighbors began to gather outside, curious about the presence of armed men in their quiet village. The landlady of the house where Margaret rented a room, an elderly woman named Abigail Foster, vehemently protested the arrest. She insisted that the tenant she knew as Sarah Mitchell was a respectable, hard-working, and pious woman who attended church every Sunday and had never caused any trouble. William patiently explained that Margaret was wanted for murder in another county, a revelation that made Abigail recoil in horror, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. The return trip to Marshall took 4 full days. Margaret traveled in a wagon driven by Marcus Flynn, with William and the other men riding alongside as escort. During the long hours on the road, Margaret remained mostly silent, staring at the passing mountains with a distant, impenetrable expression. She ate little of the provisions they offered her and slept even less during the night stops, sitting awake by the campfire while the men took turns keeping watch. On the 3rd night of their journey, while camping in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, Margaret finally broke her silence. She asked William if she could speak with him privately. William hesitated but agreed, positioning himself so that the other men could see them but not hear their conversation. Margaret began speaking softly, barely audible over the crackling of the fire and the night sounds of the forest. She told William that she knew she would be hanged, that there was no escape for her now, but that she wanted to tell the truth before they reached Marshall, before lawyers and juries and the entire machinery of justice twisted her story into something other than it had really been. William warned her that anything she said could and would be used against her in court, but Margaret waved her hand, dismissing the warning. She said she no longer cared about legal consequences, that she had carried too many heavy secrets for too long, and that there was a strange relief in finally being able to speak. Margaret began her confession by discussing her life before marrying Daniel Crowe. She had grown up poor in rural Virginia, the daughter of a tenant farmer who drank heavily and beat his wife and children when his temper flared. Margaret learned early on that women had few options in that world, that they were property passed from father to husband, that her only hope for security lay in finding a man with resources and then ensuring he wouldn't leave her destitute. She married Daniel when she was 21, attracted not by romantic love but by the stability he offered as an established businessman. The first few years were tolerable, though not happy. Daniel was a proper but cold man, more interested in his business than in his wife. Margaret began helping him with the books, discovering she had a natural talent for numbers and administration. Gradually, she became essential to his business operations, although legally she had no claim to the profits she helped generate. It was when Daniel began talking about modifying his will to exclude her almost completely, leaving everything to nephews he barely knew, that Margaret felt true terror for the first time. She had dedicated years of her life to building that business with him, and now she faced the prospect of being left with nothing when he died. She hadn't initially planned to kill him, according to her words. She just began to think about what her life would be like if he were no longer there, and how much better it would be if she could inherit everything she had helped build. Arsenic was readily available at any pharmacy or agricultural store. Margaret began by administering small doses to Daniel's food, not enough to kill him, just enough to make him mildly ill and dependent on her for care. During these weeks of controlled illness, she gently suggested that he reconsider his will, that it would be shameful to leave his devoted wife destitute. Daniel, weakened and grateful for her attention, agreed to amend his will. Margaret told William that she planned to stop the poisoning as soon as the new will was signed, that she intended to let Daniel live. But then Daniel casually mentioned during one of their bedside conversations that he was considering consulting another lawyer, that he had doubts about whether he had made the right decision. Margaret panicked. She saw years of work and planning about to crumble. That night, she gave Daniel a much larger dose of arsenic, enough to kill him within days. The subsequent investigation terrified her, but she maintained her composure, answering questions calmly, never breaking her role as a grieving widow. When the case was dropped for lack of evidence, Margaret thought she had escaped, that she could finally live the life she had secured through her terrible acts. But guilt was a constant companion, and the suspicious looks from neighbors in Richmond made every day an ordeal. Regarding the 3 men who disappeared in Richmond, Margaret confirmed what William already suspected. Albert Morrison had discovered irregularities in Daniel's business books, irregularities Margaret had created to divert funds to herself before his death. Albert confronted her, threatening to expose her to the authorities. Margaret invited him to dinner to discuss a deal and served him wine laced with strychnine. He died in her home, and she buried his body in the basement under the wooden floorboards. Charles Pemberton had been different. He had indeed courted Margaret, and she briefly considered marrying him, leading a normal life again. But Charles was poor, living only on his modest military pension, and Margaret had tasted the delights of wealth and was unwilling to return to poverty. When Charles proposed, Margaret panicked. She couldn't marry him without revealing things about her past, but she also couldn't simply refuse him without raising questions, so she poisoned him too, this time with arsenic mixed in tea, and buried his body in the same dingy cellar. Theodore Blackwell was the most complicated. He was helping Margaret sell her Richmond properties, and during the process, he began asking questions about the origin of certain funds, discrepancies in documents, and things that didn't add up in her story. Margaret sensed that Theodore was growing suspicious of her, that it was only a matter of time before he began investigating more deeply. She couldn't allow this, not when she was so close to escaping Richmond with her fortune intact. Theodore was her final murder in Richmond, poisoned and buried along with the other two. Margaret explained that she sold the Richmond house immediately after killing Theodore, before anyone could search the basement for the bodies. The new owners likely hadn't discovered them yet, assuming they had no reason to dig under the floorboards. She fled to the Appalachian Mountains specifically because she wanted a place where no one would know her, where she could start over completely. Margaret's confession continued for most of that night, her words flowing like pent-up water finally finding release. William listened in increasing silence, sometimes asking questions to clarify details, but mostly allowing her to tell her story without interruption. The other men in the escort kept a respectful distance, though occasionally William noticed Marcus Flynn glancing anxiously in his direction, clearly curious about what was being discussed. Margaret explained that her intention in moving to Madison was genuinely to start a new life. She planned to live modestly off the fortune she had accumulated through her crimes, work as a seamstress to keep up appearances, and gradually integrate into the community. For the first few months, that plan seemed to be working, but then John Patterson showed up and everything fell apart again. John Patterson wasn't a spice merchant, as he'd told Sarah Pritchard. He was a private investigator, hired by Theodore Blackwell's family, who had never accepted Theodore's sudden disappearance and suspected criminal involvement. The family had hired Patterson to track Theodore's final movements, and he had discovered the connection to Margaret. Patterson followed her trail from Richmond to the Appalachian Mountains, a patient investigation that took months, but finally led him to the door of Margaret's cabin. When Patterson knocked on the door that cold November afternoon, Margaret initially didn't realize who he was. She invited him in, offering him hot tea to ward off the autumn chill in the mountains. It was during their conversation that Patterson revealed his true identity and purpose. He explained that he knew about Theodore Blackwell, that he had evidence linking Margaret to the missing lawyer, and that he planned to bring her back to Richmond to face justice. Margaret panicked once more. Everything she had worked for, all the lives she had taken to ensure her safety and freedom, was about to be destroyed by this persistent investigator. She asked Patterson for a few minutes to think, to consider her options. Patterson agreed, probably thinking she was contemplating surrendering peacefully. Instead, Margaret went to her trunk hidden under the floorboards and made herself some arsenic-laced tea. Patterson drank the tea unsuspectingly, and within an hour began showing symptoms of poisoning. Margaret watched with a mixture of horror and resignation as he suffered, knowing she had crossed yet another line from which there would be no return. When Patterson finally died, she waited until deep dusk and then dragged his body down the mountain to Marshall. She knew Solomon Green's storehouse, knew it was rarely used during the winter, and managed to hide the body there without being seen, taking advantage of the moonless night and the deserted streets of the sleepy village. Margaret believed she had escaped once more, that Patterson's body wouldn't be discovered until spring, when she would be long gone. But then rumors began, spread by Thomas Whitfield and amplified by Reverend Morrison. The community's hostility grew quickly, becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret realized she would have to flee again, sooner than she had planned, before the snow melted completely and made the trails easily passable. The night before her departure, Margaret burned everything that could connect her to her crimes. The notebooks where she kept detailed records of her finances, including money derived from the estates of the men she had killed, fabrics she had taken from Patterson's house before hiding his body, planning to use them, but realizing too late they were incriminating evidence. Even locks of her own hair, which she had cut in a moment of desperation, thinking of changing her appearance to escape without being recognized. She left the cabin at dawn, carrying only the essentials, and followed the back trails she had learned during her months living there. Margaret traveled south through the mountains, avoiding main roads, buying provisions in villages too small to have heard of the events in Madison. It took her 3 weeks to reach Murphy, where she finally felt safe enough to settle down again, this time under the name Sarah Mitchell. The months in Murphy were the most peaceful Margaret had experienced since before Daniel Crowe's death. She worked honestly, attended church, and made genuine friendships with people who knew her only as the quiet seamstress who had arrived from somewhere up north. Part of her began to believe that perhaps she could truly leave the past behind, that she could live out the rest of her days in relative peace, but another part always knew it was only a matter of time before someone found her. When she saw William Dockery at the door, Margaret felt mostly relief. The weight of carrying so many secrets, of always looking over her shoulder, of never being able to truly trust anyone or allow herself genuine connections, was exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated when she began that terrible path years before. The prospect of facing justice, even if it meant the gallows, offered a kind of liberation. William remained silent for a long time after Margaret finished her confession. He looked at the woman sitting before him, illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire, and tried to reconcile the seemingly calm and rational person with the monstrous acts she had described. She didn't look like a monster, didn't have the savage appearance or maniacal gaze he'd unconsciously expected of someone capable of multiple murders. She just looked tired, deeply and utterly tired. He asked Margaret if she felt remorse for the men she had killed. Margaret thought carefully before answering. She said she felt remorse for Daniel, that he had been a fundamentally good man who did not deserve the fate she had given him. As for the others, she admitted she felt mostly pragmatism. They had posed threats to her freedom and safety, and she had eliminated them as one would eliminate any other obstacle. She recognized that this made her monstrous in the eyes of the law and morality, but she had learned from a young age that women did not have the luxury of morality when faced with poverty and helplessness. William had no answer for that. He was neither a philosopher nor a theologian, just a lawman trying to do his job as best he could. He thanked Margaret for her honesty and returned to the other men, bearing the weight of the revelations he had heard. Marcus asked what Margaret had said, but William merely shook his head, saying that all would be revealed in court. They arrived in Marshall the following afternoon. Word had spread that Margaret Crowe was being brought back, and practically the entire village was gathered on the main street when the wagon appeared. There were faces full of anger, people shouting insults and threats, others simply staring with morbid curiosity at the woman who had brought so much fear to their quiet community. William had to form a protective cordon with his men to guide Margaret safely to the cell in the courthouse basement. The cell where Margaret Crowe was confined was small and damp, with stone walls that constantly leaked moisture and a single narrow window near the ceiling that allowed minimal natural light. William provided a wooden cot with a straw mattress, a bucket for basic necessities, and 3 meals a day brought from Henry Bolton's tavern. Margaret accepted her circumstances without complaint, spending her days sitting in silence or reading the prayer book she had brought from Murphy. The trial was set for early September 1898, allowing sufficient time for witnesses to be called and evidence to be properly prepared. Henry Ashford served as prosecutor, presenting a meticulous case based on Margaret's confession to William, the physical evidence found in her cabin, and John Patterson's body. Margaret's defense was led by a young Asheville attorney named Robert Mercer, who reluctantly took the case after all local attorneys declined to represent her. Robert argued that Margaret's confession had been obtained under emotional duress during a grueling journey, that the physical evidence was circumstantial, and that Patterson's body could have reached Solomon's warehouse by other means. But his heart was clearly not in the case, and his objections were weak and easily overcome by the prosecution. The jury, composed of 12 men from Madison County, took less than 2 hours of deliberation to return a guilty verdict of first-degree murder. The sentence was handed down by Judge Cornelius Watkins, a 67-year-old man who had served on the North Carolina judiciary for over 3 decades. He sentenced Margaret Crowe to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for October 28, 1898, exactly 7 months to the day Josiah Hendricks discovered her abandoned cabin. Judge Watkins delivered the sentence in a grave and solemn voice, noting that Margaret's crimes represented a fundamental violation of human trust and that justice demanded the maximum punishment. Margaret listened to the sentencing without visible emotion. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before being led back to her cell, she remained standing and spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the packed courtroom. She said she accepted her sentence as fair for the crimes she had committed, but that she hoped her case would serve as a warning about the impossible circumstances women face in a society that denies them nearly all rights and opportunities. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, just understanding that desperate people often make desperate choices. Margaret's words drew mixed reactions in the courtroom. Some saw them as a manipulative attempt to gain sympathy. Others recognized an uncomfortable truth about the realities of women's lives at the time. But regardless of individual opinions, the law was clear, and Margaret would be executed as sentenced. The days following the trial brought unexpected visitors to Margaret's cell. Sarah Pritchard came, bringing wildflowers and kind words, saying that while she could not excuse Margaret's actions, she still saw in her the woman who had spoken honestly about the difficulties of living alone in a hostile world. Emma Hendricks also came, driven by equal parts Christian compassion and morbid curiosity. She brought home-cooked food and sat with Margaret for an hour, chatting about trivial matters, carefully avoiding mention of the crimes or the impending execution. Even Reverend Ezekiel Morrison visited Margaret, though his visit had a different purpose. He came to save her soul, to guide her to genuine repentance and acceptance of Jesus Christ before it was too late. Margaret listened patiently, but when he finished his passionate sermon, she gently explained that she had made peace with her fate in her own way and did not need religious intervention. The Reverend left frustrated but unsurprised, having encountered many resistant souls during his years of ministry. William Dockery also visited Margaret regularly during those final weeks. He felt strangely responsible for her, having been the one to capture her and hear her confession. They talked about mundane matters, about the changing seasons visible through the small cell window, about memories of places they had each known. William discovered that, beyond her terrible crimes, Margaret was an intelligent and articulate person, with interesting opinions on literature, politics, and human nature. It was during one of these visits that Margaret made an unusual request. She asked if William could send a letter to the Richmond police, revealing the location of the 3 bodies buried in the basement of their former home. Margaret explained that these families deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones and to be able to bury them properly. William agreed, recognizing that it was the least that could be done to bring some closure to those who had suffered years of uncertainty. The letter was sent, and weeks later, William received confirmation that the bodies of Albert Morrison, Charles Pemberton, and Theodore Blackwell had been found exactly where Margaret had said. The families were notified, proper burials were held, and at least that small measure of justice was served. But the revelation also definitively confirmed that Margaret Crowe was responsible for not just one, but at least 6 murders over the course of 15 years, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in North Carolina history up to that point. The morning of October 28th dawned cold and clear, with a cloudless blue sky and frost covering the grass surrounding the courthouse. The gallows had been erected in the building's rear courtyard, a simple but functional structure of thick wood, with 13 steps leading up to the platform where the executioner awaited. A crowd of approximately 300 people gathered to witness the execution, some from Marshall, but many from neighboring counties drawn by the notoriety of the case. Margaret was brought from her cell at 9 o'clock in the morning. She wore a simple grey cotton dress that Sarah Pritchard had brought, and her hair was carefully combed into a severe bun. Her hands were tied in front of her, but she walked with an erect posture and evident dignity. William Dockery escorted her to the gallows, offering his arm as she climbed the 13 steps, each step echoing in the tense silence of the courtyard. At the top of the platform, Judge Watkins read the sentence once more. Then he asked if Margaret had any final words. She looked out over the gathered crowd, her gaze sweeping over faces both familiar and unfamiliar, and spoke in a voice that never wavered. She said she was sorry for the pain she had caused, that she understood her actions had been unforgivable, able, but who faced her destiny without fear. She concluded by saying that the mountains hold many secrets, and that hers would finally be released with her death. The black hood was placed over her head, the rope tightened around her neck. The executioner pulled the lever, and Margaret Crowe fell through the trapdoor. Her death was instantaneous, her neck breaking cleanly from the fall. The body remained hanging for 20 minutes, as required by law, before being lowered and handed over to Dr. Benjamin Clark for a final examination. Margaret was buried in Marshall Cemetery, in a separate area reserved for executed criminals, with no headstone marking the spot. Only a wooden stake with a carved number marked her resting place. But for years after her death, people swore they saw a woman walking the slopes of Mount Mitchell at twilight, always ascending toward the abandoned cabin that no one ever occupied again. Margaret's cabin stood for another 3 years before finally collapsing under the weight of snow during a particularly harsh winter. The rubble was left where it fell, gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Today, more than a century later, almost nothing remains to mark the spot where those disturbing events unfolded, only a moss-covered stone foundation and faded memories in dusty county records. Margaret Crowe's case left a lasting mark on Marshall and Madison County. The community became more wary of outsiders, more vigilant about